I posted this tweet a few weeks ago, and it said, "Dear brands and companies, please don't ask artists to sign work for hire agreements. Dear artist, please don't sign work for hire agreements unless you're fine with signing your rights away forever and forever." And, you know, I have my opinion of why I wrote this and why I put that out there, but I really wanted to have an expert opinion on what actually a work for hire agreement is and when you should be signing it and maybe when you shouldn't be signing it, which, you know, from my point of view, I never sign it. But I thought it'd be great just to educate people out there, especially artists, and, you know, we need support and we need these resources. So I found a professional. I found someone with tons of experience. So I'd love you to introduce yourself and tell us, you know, why you're qualified to answer this question and help us out here.
Absolutely. My name is Jonay Williams. I am an attorney, and I work specifically with artists and creative people on protecting their rights, on starting businesses, on filing and creating their intellectual property, so many different things, contracts, business agreements, you know, publishing agreements, just the whole gamut of things. So this is an area that I've been in practice for about 10 years, and I've been working with artists consistently for the last 20 years. So this is definitely an area that I come across quite a bit. My experience in the industry was I also started off as an artist, and I was working in the industry as a creative professional. I was a vocalist, so I did background vocals and I did songwriting, and I was told that I would be credited and compensated for my work, and that did not happen. And so it kind of led me down this path of wanting to help artists and creative people empower themselves so that they don't get taken advantage of in the same types of ways that I did when I was in the industry. And I'd seen so much of that because my mom was also she was in the music industry as well. She was a record promoter. And so she worked with, you know, big names and big acts. So I constantly was around artists and creative people and working with them specifically on the things they need to do in order to protect themselves. So this is definitely my wheelhouse, so to speak. And so I'm happy to speak about this topic, and thank you for inviting me to talk about it.
Well, thank you. And so let's start off with, you know, if there's a way to summarize it. I know sometimes these agreements and licenses can be explained all day, but in a nutshell, what is a work for hire agreement?
Okay, so a work for hire agreement is basically an agreement that a company will give an artist to work with them to create a product or a service or an item or piece of art for them in order for them to use and monetize in some type of way. So if you are a professional for hire, so for example, if we're talking about music, if you are a musician who does the background tracks for different artists, and you basically go and you do that aspect of the music for them, but you're not necessarily a part of their band, then you would essentially sign a work for hire agreement saying, you're going to pay me, I'm going to come in and create this work, and then I'm out of there, you do with it whatever it is that you need to do. And so that happens in every medium, whether you are a musician, whether you are a visual artist, whether you are any type of maker. These are the agreements that you'll come across typically when you are dealing with larger companies and larger brands.
Okay, so just to summarize with that, so when you do a work for hire, you no longer have any claim or ownership on any IP or copyright. So you've essentially, if this was your music or this is your art, you've said, I'll take the money in exchange, you take all of this and I'll have no claim on it ever again.
Yeah, well, it depends, because there are some work for hire agreements that divide up the rights in a particular type of way. So it depends on what the clause of the intellectual property component of the work for hire says. So for example, if you're a, let's just say you're a graphic designer and there's a clause that is a work for hire clause, you could say that I own all the underlying works to what it is that I created. However, you own the final website, you own the final product that, you know, that we sign off on at the end of the day. And that is essentially you haven't given away all of your intellectual property. You still own your IP for the underlying work, but they own the final product. So that's an alternative to the typical, I'm just going to take the money, you take all the rights, and, you know, and that's it. But in work for hires is typically arranged the way that you mentioned.
Yeah. So the standard is usually I'll take the money and you take the work.
Right.
And I think, you know, something a lot of artists don't understand is that when you do work with a work for hire agreement, it also means that they can, you know, unless you've stipulated separately in further writing, but once they own it, they can change it, they can edit it, they can use it for in perpetuity. They don't have to just use it for this one project that you thought that they were using it with, because now they own the copyright because it was a work for hire. They can use it forever and ever in any way that they might see fit.
Yes, and again, it does depend, because you can have a stipulation in your contract that says that this work is only to be used in the particular way by which I'm signing this agreement to give it to you. So, but if you're signing away all your rights, meaning you have no claim to the intellectual property, the underlying work, or anything whatsoever, then yes, they can take it because they now own the rights to it. They can take it, manipulate it, they can use it, reuse it, monetize it, create derivative works from it. They can do all of that as it relates to it if you sign the work for hire agreement and it says that. That's the reason why it's so important for artists to have someone who's a professional look over the contract and actually tell you what's contained in it, because you can end up signing away all of your rights to that creative work. And that's not necessarily a bad thing when you have no claim to the work, in terms of it's not related to any work that you're creating for your own uses, right? So you might create a piece of art or a sculpture or something like that for a lobby, and you have no desire to use that. It has nothing to do with your aesthetic. It might be something completely different than the work that you normally do, and they're actually asking you to do something different than what you normally do that you use in your own creative work. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but when I talk to artists about that, I say, if you're going to sign an agreement like that, you need to understand that you are signing away your rights to that work. You have no control over the way that they use it. And you know, you better make sure that they're paying you a pretty penny if they're going to be doing all of that and you're not keeping any kind of rights, because the intellectual property rights are more important, in my opinion, than the actual money that you're going to get for that one shot deal.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. So if you are considering doing a project and that project is work for hire, the compensation should reflect that. You know, yes. The compensation should reflect that you are potentially signing a standard work for hire agreement. So the compensation should be way higher, because it means that you're also not just giving them the work, you're giving them the copyright, the IP, and you're giving them the potential in the future, unless you've stipulated otherwise.
Yes, absolutely. And it can be, work for hires are not all bad, in terms of it can be mutually beneficial. If you're a working artist and you are and you're someone who isn't necessarily trying to put out their own brand, but you just want to create work and you're just interested in being hired to create work, you like the idea of working with different companies and creating new projects and things like that, and you have no intention on trying to monetize them on your own yourself, it's not necessarily a bad trade-off to sign a work for hire agreement if that's your mindset. But if you're the type of creator like the ones that we know today, who you're building your own brand, you're building your own presence, you're putting out your work in order for you to be able to build your own business structure underneath you, then a work for hire agreement might not necessarily be the best option for you. And if it is, then, or if it is something that you're considering, then you might want to be a little bit more strict with where the work goes, how it's used, and those types of things. And that would be in the intellectual property clause of that work for hire agreement.
Okay, so that's great. So in that clause, you can negotiate, I guess, all the places where it will show up, and perhaps the length of time for that. Is that something you can do?
Yeah, you can, and it also depends on if that company is willing to, because there's some companies that are like, look, this is what we do, this is our standard, keep it moving. And then you have to decide whether that's a company that you want to work with or not. Personally, I think that if a company's not willing to negotiate with an artist who is then going to create work for them, then they're probably not a company that you want to be aligned with and that you want to work with in the future, because you have no idea if they're already unwilling to work with you and negotiate. Then you have no idea how they're going to use the work in the future, and it might be in ways that you're not okay with, so it is important for you to work with companies that you feel are aligned with you, and look at that section of the agreement and see what you can and cannot negotiate if you're in a space where you're building your own brand and creating your own work. If you're an artist who is like, look, I'm just hands for hire, I'm gonna work for hire, then it might not be as important to you. And I do know artists that are like that. They're like, I just want to get paid and work consistently. And so, for example, even if we're looking at and I know I keep referencing the music world, but this is the only thing that's coming to mind right now. If artists are just working musicians and they just come in, they play, certain pieces of a song and they move on, they get paid for that. And then they move on to the next studio session and the next studio session and the next one. They're not interested in building up their own presence and being, their own star. They're really just interested in keeping work coming in consistently for the creativity that they're putting out in the world. So
I think that's a great point. So there's almost, there's many different avenues here. If you're an artist that, maybe your work is more design driven, it's you're creating patterns, and those patterns might be for textiles or for fashion, or in magazines, or you're creating design work which goes or lives on other people's websites. Then the sense of a work for hire makes sense, because it's not a signature style, it's not something that's recognizable, and it's maybe something that you can do hundreds of these and you're quite happy to sign a work for hire. Then there's that other avenue when you're an artist who have a distinctive style and something that is extremely recognizable and is almost a signature. Then I think that's when great caution should, be in play, because, that is almost your bread and butter. It's this signature thing that you wouldn't not want to have control of where it lives, on what products it lives, on what brands it lives.
Right.
And so I think, if you are going down that work for hire route, consider what you're putting out there and if it's a good fit, and if not, also do the same thing. I think another thing to keep in mind is that, two things. There's, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think there's no such thing as a standard contract. And, every time you meet these big companies, they say, we have a standard contract. And I say, well, I'm not a standard artist. And the work isn't standard either. So, let's be creative and make a contract for this project. Also, keep in mind that people at these companies change. And they might say, I'm not going to use your work for this. Don't trust me. Your work won't end up in this in the future. But who knows how long they will be working for this company. And, who knows what might happen to them. But then the company owns this agreement. And someone who comes along 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years in the future might say, hey, we own the rights to this. Let's use it.
I agree. And the other thing that you want to think about is with contracts, the contract is what is going to is going to be the thing that lives on. It's the document that lives on that is basically administering the deal that you are doing with this company. So so it doesn't matter who is in place or who leaves or who comes in and whatnot. If they're a representative of the company at the time that you sign the agreement is what is going to live on in terms of it being what is governing the relationship between you and that company. And so you want to make sure that in the agreement, the terms are outlined in the way that you want them to be outlined, because you're right, officers change, people change, and things like that. And the contract is what is governing the relationship. And if you are an artist who is someone who has recognizable work like yourself, someone who is putting out their own brand and their own work, I don't recommend that you sign work for hire agreements unless the work for hire agreement is for something that isn't around your recognizable work and identity. If it is, then yes, licensing could be in place. Yes, being paid for that particular creative work, creating a partnership where you receive a certain percentage of the revenues that come in for the work that you created that is then being sold and monetized. These are the options that are better for an artist who is out here putting out their work in a way where it's recognizable, it's part of their brand, it's part of their aesthetic, and they're using it as a way to create their own unique business and put their money and get their money. So it depends on what lane you are in your career and what kind of work that you're doing, which would garner whether you should sign a work for hire agreement or not. But either way it goes, never put your signature to anything that you haven't looked over and a qualified professional hasn't looked over as well.
Yeah. So you just mentioned an alternative there. You mentioned the license agreement. Would you just be able to explain a little bit about what that is?
Yes, absolutely. So a licensing agreement is basically an agreement where you can give a company a certain amount of time to monetize a particular creative work that you are giving them. You're giving them permission to use a certain creative work, monetize it for a certain amount of time, and they're paying you a fee or a rate as it relates to that. So though licensing agreements can get very, very complicated, that's the long and short of it. But what you can do in those agreements is you can have a certain percentage coming to you. They could pay you one big standard fee, for the work. It can be a royalty arrangement where you're receiving royalties off of particular works that they are monetizing on their end, and you're receiving a certain percentage, and that percentage can be, large or small. It really just depends. And in licensing agreements, I really like them for artists who are like you putting out your work, because what you can do is you can make it revocable. So if you don't like what the company's doing or how they're representing the work or what's happening with the work, you can then revoke their license to use it. So you also still retain your intellectual property rights. You keep those in place. So for if you're doing something like that, it's a lot more flexible in the way that the work is created, the way that it's used, the way that it's monetized, and then the way that that you decide that you want to either continue to let them use it or revoke their license.
Fantastic. And then, so my last question, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, my last question is, okay, so I'm an artist, I need to pay my rent, I need to eat, and a company has offered me a really nice project, and they give me, a standard agreement.
Standard.
They give me a standard agreement. I don't have a lawyer. I can't afford a lawyer. I would read this project. I don't really know how to read an agreement. What should I do? This is good money. I need to pay rent. I don't have access to a lawyer. What do I do?
Well, there's a couple of things that you can do. Number one is there are lawyers who do pro bono hours, and they do pro bono advising. It's not a requirement for lawyers to do this. However, we also understand that every creative person and artist cannot afford to have a lawyer at the very, very beginnings of their career. And so most lawyers every year have a certain amount of hours that they use that are pro bono hours that they allocate to particular projects that they want to work on or people that they want to work with. So if you know a lawyer who specifically work with somebody who deals with intellectual property and business, if you know a lawyer like that, or you get recommended to a lawyer like that, you can ask them about their pro bono hours. The other thing is, if you're in the United States, and also, I mean, internationally too, but if you're in the United States, there's an organization called Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts. They actually will connect you with a attorney who has pro bono hours available, and they will help you secure an attorney to work on a particular deal for you. If you can't do that, then there's also performing rights organizations and artist rights organizations that can help you sift through that. Harvard also has a program where they look at agreements and arrangements for artists. I don't know the name of it right now, but if you look on Harvard's website, they have an organization that specifically does that as well. So there are resources out there. You just kind of have to do your Googles and look for them. But yeah.
All right, amazing. And then so, yeah, if you have any links, please share them, and then I'll put them kind of in the description below here.
Absolutely. I'll send you, I'll give you the link for the Harvard organization, and I'll also put the Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts link under, but you can also Google it. But there's one in just about every single state. And if not, then, you know, internationally, there are always organizations that are nonprofits and organizations that are willing to help artists and work with those kinds of things, because they know.
So fantastic. So to summarize, you know, if you get that standard agreement, read it yourself, always have someone else read it, have a professional read it. If you need to get professional, go to one of these organizations and, you know, just tell that client, hey, hold on, you know, I need someone else to read this. And there's lots of resources out there. If you're doing something that's uniquely a signature piece of yours, then, you know, really consider signing that work for hire before you do it.
Mm-hmm.
You can have less consideration if you're doing something that isn't really a standout signature piece, maybe if it's more design orientated or more pattern orientated. But everything is really case by case, but it's something you should be really cautious of.
Absolutely. And again, just think about, before you actually sign it, think about what your internally, like, what is it that you are interested in doing with your career. If you're interested in putting out your work in order for you to monetize it yourself, at any point in the near future, you may want to consider maybe not signing a work for hire agreement. If you're somebody who's like, look, I'm a working artist and I make stuff for people and I'm not interested in doing that, then it may be a good option for you. But either way it goes, read it.
Okay, fantastic. Super appreciate your time. I think that's really informative, and it's nice to talk to a professional about this.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You stay away from them though.
Cool.